Picture a doctor's waiting room. A television bolted to the wall, playing quiet health tips between drug ads, the kind of screen you've probably stared at 100 times without really seeing it. Now picture that screen lying to you, not about the medicine, about whether it was ever really on at all. Somewhere behind that screen was a company that convinced the smartest investors in America it was one of the most valuable startups in the country, worth more, on paper, than half the airlines in the sky. And almost none of it was real. Every fraud starts the same way it will end, as a single false entry in a ledger somebody was supposed to check and didn't. This one just happened to be worth over $1 billion. Scroll 1. The setup. Chicago, 2006. Two college friends, Rishi Shah and Shraddha Agarwal, started a company called Context Media with a simple pitch: put screens in doctors' waiting rooms, fill them with health content, and sell the advertising space to the companies who wanted patients' attention most, pharmaceutical giants. It wasn't a flashy idea. It was, on paper, almost boring, which is exactly what made it believable. By 2017, the company had rebranded itself Outcome Health, and it wasn't boring anymore. It was Chicago's brightest startup story, the kind local politicians loved standing next to. The city's mayor at the time, Rahm Emanuel, stood at a company event and declared, "As outcome goes, so goes Chicago." Rishi Shah himself was close with the state's governor, a rising star in a city that wanted a tech success story of its own. And then, in May 2017, that story appeared to be validated in the most convincing way possible. Outcome Health raised $500 million in a single funding round, from Goldman Sachs, from Google's parent company Alphabet, from the venture arm of a Silicon Valley legend's widow, at a jaw-dropping valuation. $5.5 billion. The single most valuable venture-backed startup in the entire state of Illinois. But here's the detail almost nobody clocked at the time, buried inside the deal. Of that $500 million raised, $225 million was quietly set aside, not to grow the business, not to hire the 2,000 employees the company had promised, but as a personal dividend paid directly to Shah and Agarwal. Most founders don't cash out before their company has proven anything. That should have been the first quiet alarm bell. Almost nobody heard it ring. Scroll 2. The turn. To understand how a company convinces the smartest investors on Wall Street to hand over $500 million, you have to go back further than the headlines, back to 2011, years before anyone outside Chicago had heard the name Context Media. That's when, according to federal prosecutors, the lie first entered the ledger. The company began selling advertising space to pharmaceutical clients, space on screens that, in many cases, hadn't actually been installed yet. Here's how the scheme worked, and it's simpler and darker than you'd expect. Outcome would promise a client their ad would run in, say, 1,600 doctors' offices, and then quietly, deliberately, under-deliver on that promise. Instead of admitting the shortfall, the company just kept billing as if every single screen had done exactly what was promised. The clients paid full price for advertising that, in some cases, was only a fraction as real as they'd been told. And this wasn't a mystery to the people running the company. Internally, Outcome Health was quietly handing out tens of millions of dollars in free, make-good advertising to clients whose campaigns had fallen short. A tacit admission on paper of exactly the gap the company was denying to everyone else. In other words, they knew the screens weren't delivering. They just kept billing as if they were. And when outside auditors came to check the books, the one safeguard designed specifically to catch this, the company didn't let the truth anywhere near them. According to prosecutors, the company's own chief financial officer caused employees to fabricate data specifically to keep the auditor from ever seeing. 2 years of financial statements, 2015 and 2016, were built on numbers that didn't reflect reality. Revenue overstated by at least $14 million in 1 year and $30 million in the next. It wasn't a rounding error. It was a company lying to the one profession whose entire job is to catch companies lying. Scroll 3. The escalation. Here's where the story stops being a spreadsheet problem and becomes something closer to a heist. Because Outcome Health didn't just use those fabricated numbers to keep existing clients happy, they used them as bait. In April 2016, using those inflated 2015 revenue figures as proof of the company's health, Outcome secured $110 million in new debt financing. 8 months later, in December 2016, they went back for more, $375 million this time, using the same falsified story. That April 2016 round did something else too, quietly. Out of the money raised, Shah personally pocketed a $30.2 million dividend, and Agarwal took $7.5 million, money that, within months, was funding weekend trips on private jets and yachts, and would eventually help pay for an $8 million mansion on Chicago's North Side. And then came the big one. In early 2017, riding a wave of manufactured credibility, Outcome Health raised that staggering $487.5 million equity round, the one that valued the company at $5.5 billion and made front-page business news. Think about what that means for a moment. Every dollar of that fundraising, the debt, the equity, the headlines, the mayor's applause, was built on top of a lie that had started years earlier as a simple case of overbilling. The company kept expanding the illusion in every direction it could reach. That same year, Outcome Health announced a partnership with Harvard Medical School, the kind of institutional credibility that makes skeptical investors stop asking questions entirely. Behind the scenes, the company was even accused of manipulating the independent research studies meant to prove its ads actually worked, inflating the very engagement numbers pharmaceutical clients relied on to justify spending millions more. Every layer of verification that was supposed to catch this fraud had, one by one, been quietly compromised. By the middle of 2017, Outcome Health looked less like a startup and more like an empire. And empires like this one only fall one way, all at once. Scroll 4. The unraveling. Here's the detail that makes this next part almost unbearably ironic. On the very same day, in May 2017, that Outcome Health proudly announced its $500 million raise and its $5.5 billion valuation, the single biggest headline the company would ever generate. A former analyst named David Ma quietly sent an email to a Wall Street Journal reporter. He'd read the celebratory coverage, and he didn't believe it deserved to exist. "If you are interested," he wrote, "I have some additional information on Outcome Health that I'd be willing to share." He called it simply the less than rosy stuff. For 5 months, nothing happened. The champagne toasts continued, the valuation stood, the mayor kept smiling in photos with the founders, and somewhere, quietly, a reporter kept digging. Then, in October 2017, the story landed, and inside it was the sentence that started pulling the entire structure apart. Employees, the report revealed, had been misleading pharmaceutical clients with inflated performance data for years. Reporters found specific examples. Case studies claiming nearly 1,600 doctors' offices had run a particular ad campaign when the company's own raw data told a very different story. Within days, cracks started showing at the top. Outcome's chief operating officer resigned suddenly. The company called it a family decision. Almost nobody believed that was the whole story. Then, in November 2017, the investors who'd handed over almost $500 million just months earlier did something founders dread more than almost anything. They turned around and sued. Goldman Sachs, Alphabet's investment arm, the venture firm of Laurene Powell Jobs. They wanted their money back. Specifically, they wanted to freeze that $225 million dividend Shah and Agarwal had quietly pocketed at the top of the deal. Suddenly, the detail nobody had questioned in May looked exactly like what it was. Federal investigators didn't wait long to get involved. Both the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission opened investigations into the company that, 6 months earlier, had been Illinois's proudest startup story. The empire that had been built entry by entry, lie by lie, in a ledger nobody checked closely enough, was now being unwound the same way. One document, one subpoena, one testimony at a time. Scroll 5. Consequences and takeaway. By 2019, the walls had fully closed in. Outcome Health agreed to pay $70 million to resolve the federal investigation, formally admitting that fraud had run through the company from 2012 all the way to 2017. 4 former executives, Shah Agarwal, Chief Financial Officer Brad Purdy, and Executive Vice President Ashik Desai, were indicted on charges of fraud. Desai and 2 former analysts chose to plead guilty and cooperate with prosecutors rather than face trial. Shah, Agarwal, and Purdy did not. They fought the charges, for years insisting they weren't the architects of what prosecutors described as a billion-dollar scheme. In the meantime, the civil case moved faster. Shah and Agarwal settled with their furious investors by stepping down from their executive roles entirely and handing back $159 million of the money they'd taken out. Then, in early 2023, after a 10-week federal trial, a jury reached its verdict. Guilty on multiple counts of mail fraud, wire fraud, and bank fraud for all 3. In 2024, the sentences came down. Rishi Shah, the co-founder who once stood beside a sitting mayor as Chicago's newest success story, was sentenced to 7.5 years in federal prison. Brad Purdy received 2 years and 3 months. Shraddha Agarwal was sentenced to 3 years in a halfway house. By then, prosecutors had already laid out exactly where the money went. Court filings detailed $1.5 million on Shah's credit card in a single 10-month stretch alone, over $100,000 on wine, $80,000 at a Christie's auction house, tens of thousands more on yachting and designer clothing. Prosecutors made a point of noting the spending didn't stop once Shah knew he was under criminal investigation. It continued anyway. As part of the sentencing, authorities seized the $8 million mansion that Jet Set Lifestyle had helped buy. The house that once quietly stood behind the headlines was, in the end, the thing they actually came to collect. The company itself didn't survive as anyone remembered it. What was once valued at $5.5 billion, today majority owned by a private equity firm that picked through what remained. So what actually happened here? A handful of people convinced some of the most sophisticated investors in the world, Goldman Sachs, Google, teams built specifically to sniff out exactly this kind of risk, that a lie was a business. And it worked. For 6 years it worked, right up until one newspaper article pulled a single thread and the entire structure came down with it. Every fraud in this ledger starts the same way, with someone deciding a smaller lie is easier than an honest number. The only question that changes from story to story is how long it takes and how many zeros get added before somebody finally checks. This is Ledger of Lies. Click here for more lies.